first of all, welcome everyone who's come along to this educational. This is the second part of the educational series on James O'Toole's book, The Irish State and Revolution. And this meeting today is about the Gardaí, the history and the role of the Gardaí in Ireland. So what's going to happen is that James is going to be talking for about 20-25 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for discussion, questions and answers and that kind of stuff. And just to let people know, we're recording the talk for our YouTube series. However, we won't be recording the discussion, so you can feel free to ask any questions and all that kind of stuff. You won't be recorded when we go into that. So I ask James to start. So James O'Toole, for anyone who doesn't know him, James is a long-time socialist activist, just written the book called The Irish State and Revolution, and that's why we're doing the educational series here. So James?
Yeah, I suppose over the last few weeks here in Ireland, we've seen a number of occasions where people have been discussing the role of the police, whether it's the Debenhams workers in Blanchardstown who, to defend their picket line and fight for their redundancies, you know, they sat down in front of a scab truck that was trying to take stock out of Debenhams, and the police came along and dragged, you know, forcibly removed them from the picket line. Or we've seen the Incenshow family in Blanchardstown. George Incenshow was shot by the cops a couple of weeks ago, and the family have been fighting for an inquiry, and the police, you know, piled on top of George Incenshow's a mourning mother and his brother. So, I mean, there's been a debate about, you know, when the police do something like that, people often say, oh, why aren't the police doing their real job? As if the real role of the police is to fight crime, and that these interventions on strikes and protests and misbehavior by the police, as well as corruption by the police force, is somehow the exception, and that their real job is to fight crime. I want to actually argue that fighting crime is the exception, and that the real role of the police is actually to intervene in class struggle and to police the working class and oppressed people. That their job is to maintain the inequality that you know, and the society that we live in. Now, policing in Ireland goes back to the British. The British first introduced police forces in Ireland. It was Robert Peel, the founder of the London Metropolitan Police, who came to Ireland in 1812. And 1812, you just had Wolfe Tone, the 1798 rebellion. In other words, you just had an uprising by people in Ireland. And you had a lot of groups like the White Boys, like a lot of rural groups, poor people who were kind of rebelling. So in a way, Robert Peel was sent to Ireland to start discussing the formation of a police force to tackle revolutionary movements, to tackle uprisings of the people, to tackle people who were responding to poverty. And it's no coincidence that police forces were being formed not only in Ireland, but in Britain and over in America in the early 1800s. Because if you think about it, people were beginning to become concentrated in factories. They were beginning to be concentrated in cities. And so you had large urban crowds. So the police weren't formed. The first important point I want to make is that the police weren't formed in relation to crime. And there wasn't a huge wave of crime suddenly in the early 1800s. What there was the formation of a large urban class, the working class. The police were formed to police the working class. The history of the working class and the history of the police go side by side. And Ireland is no exception. For example, in Dublin, you know, in the Middle Ages in Dublin, there wasn't a police force. There was a bunch of old men called the Thistle Guard, who walked around with lamps and, you know, just made sure there was nothing dodgy going on. You know, that was enough to kind of police the city. But if you think about it, as Dublin grows and, you know, people were, you know, employed in transport, mainly transporting a lot of the agricultural products that were being sucked out of Ireland by the empire, you know, came through Dublin. So Dublin had a lot of working class people employed in transport, in the docks and stuff like that. And they formed the British had to form two police forces to deal with this different class composition in terms of Dublin and the rest of Ireland. So for rural Ireland, they set up the RIC, which would be, unlike the British police force, would be an armed police force, because they were dealing with the potential of insurrection from poor Irish people. And then in Dublin, where you were dealing with the working class, they had an unarmed police force, which was modelled on the London Metropolitan Police. Now, the reason they go for an unarmed police force when they're dealing with the working class is that if you've got a class that works in the factories, and if you push things too far or you shoot a few strikers, you could actually trigger a general strike that could shut down production and stop your profits. So in other words, the fact that they use the baton when they're dealing with the working class is because they actually fear the potential strength of an urban crowd to actually shut down capitalism, to shut down the system. So in rural Ireland, you had a system of armed police, and in Dublin, you had the Dublin Metropolitan Police. I mean, the Dublin Metropolitan Police became most infamous. You know, people know about Connolly and Larkin and the lockout, where the Dublin Metropolitan Police, you know, battered the striking workers off the streets. You know, a worker was even killed. But what a lot of people don't know is that when the treaty was signed, the truce was signed in July 1921, which then led to the treaty with Britain and the formation of the Irish Free State, that the Dublin Metropolitan Police were kept on and incorporated into the Gardaí. So the policemen who had battened Connolly and Larkin, the policemen who were the servants not only of the British Empire, but also of employers like William Martin Murphy, when employers like William Martin Murphy took down the Union Jack and put up the tricolour, they wanted to maintain the same kind of control over the Dublin working class. And so the Dublin Metropolitan Police, when the treaty was signed, were told to stay at their stations. They would be incorporated into whatever police force was to follow the foundation of the new state. And you might think, well, why would this, you know, new Irish Republic require the services of a police force that had, you know, worked so well in keeping people down for the British Empire? And I suppose it's obvious that there were people who had led the Irish Revolution, people like Kevin O'Higgins, you know, people from very upper class backgrounds who wanted to make sure that the revolution wasn't about Connolly's vision of socialism or working class power, that the revolution was about establishing a replica of the British state where the people who owned the factories and offices under the Union Jack still owned the factories and offices in the slums under the tricolour. And so the RIC were disbanded in 1922, and the Civic Guard was set up, which is what the Garda were first called. They were called the Civic Guard. But policing in England was modelled, followed a model whereby you had policing bodies, and the police were answerable to policing bodies. Obviously, the police in the end still served the interests of the rich, but there was some kind of token kind of sop the oversight. In Ireland, Dublin Castle, the centre of the British kind of, you know, policing in Ireland and the British oppression of Ireland, Dublin Castle had always had a direct relationship to the police without any oversight bodies. Because why would the British Empire want oversight on what they were doing in Ireland? So when the Free State, when the rich boys who wanted to bury the legacy of Connolly and wanted to form an Irish state that was a replica of the British state, when people like Kevin and Higgins and them came to power, they didn't adopt the model of policing in Britain. They adopted the Dublin Castle model of policing. They actually, you know, incorporated no oversight, no public oversight of the police, and the police would be directly answerable to them in government, so that the police would be tools, direct tools of the political power. And they used the RIC manuals. The force was to be unarmed, but because the Civil War was going on, they made sure lots of Garda stations had stashes of guns hidden out the back. So it was a very, right from the start, the context of the birth of the Gardaí, you know, where you had a free state consolidating itself. It was consolidating itself as a state of the rich. It was trying to evict workers from factories that had been occupied. It was trying to push back the Irish Revolution and any aspiration that the Irish working class would have that the revolution against Britain would lead to socialism. And it's in that context that our police force was born. So they were arresting Republican prisoners, they were beating people up without charge, they got used to rough handling prisoners, they got used to, doing dodgy things. So you could see that right from the birth process of the police force. Every police force is about policing urban crowds, predominantly about policing the working class. But in Ireland, the birth of the state in a counter-revolution actually tainted the Gardaí as an institution from the very start, because they were unaccountable and they were, allowed to beat people up. And that continued for decades. I mean, in the 1970s, the so-called heavy gang, which was like special branch, used to go around beating confessions out of people. I mean, there's one example here of a 26-year-old soldier, Christy Lynch, who was made to confess to a murder he didn't commit. They just rounded people up and beat confessions out of them. And I mean, there's countless examples, and I don't want to get into every single example, because I want to say something about policing in the north too. I mean, in the north, the RIC, the police force of the British occupation of Ireland, was just renamed the RUC. It was still the same sectarian machinery in the north. And right from the start, they recruited from loyalist terror gangs. They broke into Catholic homes. They executed people. They instituted a reign of terror across the north to destroy any aspiration that people in the north might have for uniting Ireland, or for fighting for a united Ireland, or resisting partition. So the police force in the north wasn't just about holding urban crowds down, like all police forces are, holding down the working class, but it was also about implementing a sectarian terror to terrify the Catholic population into submission. And right up until the civil rights movement in the 60s, where people started to protest for civil rights, we saw that the response of the RUC in the north was to terrorize people, to batten people off the streets. It was the B Specials, the police force in the north, that smashed up the Bogside. And, people were afraid that there was going to be actually pogroms against Catholics. And so the Bogside rose up to defend the area. But they had shoot to kill policies in the 1970s. And people may have seen the recent documentary about the Glenanne gang, which was a loyalist terror gang, that went on a murder spree across the north, and their tight links to the RUC. And then when the Good Friday Agreement came along, the RUC rebranded as the PSNI. But the last 20 years, we've seen so much, acts of intimidation by the police, corruption by the police, that again, the change from RUC to PSNI is just really rebranding the same entity and the same institution. So I just want to say something about the Irish prison system too, because that's connected to the police. The prisons in Ireland, and it's also connected to our solutions to policing and opposition to policing. 79% of men in Irish prisons are there for petty theft. So in other words, 80% of people 80% of men in Irish prisons are there for petty theft. In other words, a small crime, like stealing a loaf of bread or not paying their TV license. 95% of women in Irish prisons are there for petty theft. In other words, 80% of men and 95% of women in prison are there because they're poor. 861 people in prison right now are there because they didn't pay fines. Again, they're there because of poverty. And shockingly, 400 people are in prison right now because of immigration rules. So in other words, they're only in prison because they overstayed, because they didn't have the right permits and stuff like that. So you can already see that the policing and prison system has a relation to inequality and is about actually policing the poor rather than dealing with crime. So I mean, why are the Gardaí corrupt? Why is there so much corruption in the Gardaí? And I think there's a few things that we can say about this from what I've just said about the history of the Gardaí. That class is often defined by three things. One, whether or not you own the companies, the factories, the offices. I mean, the people that own your company are the bosses. They're the capitalists. Those of us that work for a wage, we're the workers. We're the vast majority. So a lot of people would say, well, then are the police workers? Well, actually, there's three things you need to define someone's class position or their class relationship. One is whether or not they own the factory or the office. The other is whether or not they exploit people or assist in exploitation. So the boss exploits workers for profit. So the boss is a capitalist, the workers are members of the working class, and the police earn a wage. So you might think that they're workers, but actually, because they assist in the exploitation of the working class, they help to maintain a system of exploitation over the working class, that the police then are actually not members of the working class because they help to exploit the working class. They're members of a separate caste that work for the capitalist class to keep working class people down. And the third point, if you're trying to analyze someone's class position, is their relationship to other classes. So whether or not they own the factories, the offices, the machinery, whether or not they exploit people or help to exploit people, and what is their relationship to other classes. So if we look at the police from that point of view, yes, they don't own the factories and the offices, they're not the capitalists. They do help to exploit people, so they're not quite workers. And three, their relationship to other classes, their relationship to the working class is one of maintaining the system of exploitation and maintaining the status quo and keeping working class people down. And so if you think about it, maintaining a corrupt and unequal society is inherently a corrupting job. If you join the police thinking, I'm going to join the police and fight crime, and then after a few months you realize that you're pulling middle-aged women off a picket line in Blanchardstown because they're fighting for the redundancy, or you have to go and deport a 12-year-old Nigerian boy in a school uniform back to Nigeria where he knows no one. That's actually that actually happened. They deported a child back to Lagos. You get demoralized, or you leave the police force because that's not what you joined for, or you start to enjoy your job. In other words, you start to rationalize to yourself, well, maybe he deserved it, and maybe those workers should just obey the law. In other words, human beings are rationalization machines. We can't wake up in the morning and justify what we do every day to ourselves unless we start to believe in what we do. And so it's no coincidence that police forces around the world usually have the most reactionary ideas in relation to the general population. They're usually on the right and on the far right of the spectrum when it comes to beliefs. And that's no coincidence. It's to do with their role assisting exploitation and holding the working class down. In the last 2 or 3 minutes, I want to talk, what are the alternatives to the police? I mean, there's a lot of debate in America about alternatives to the police because they're shooting down, people in black communities, and communities, especially black communities in the United States, are asking, well, what do you do about crime, and how do you deal with gang violence and things like that if you don't have a police force? So, you want to call for alternatives to the police that improve life for people and also diminish crime. And I think there are alternatives. Number one, if you made drugs a health issue, first of all, you get rid of the cartels. You get rid of petty crime. Where people are feeding a habit because they have to rob to feed their addiction. If you make drugs a health issue and deal with it through the health system rather than through policing, that will have a huge impact on huge amounts of petty crime. The second thing is mental health funding. Most of the time, in a lot of crimes, especially when it comes to interpersonal violence, people are having a mental health crisis. There's a statistic here. Every single month, 20 to 30 people are waiting for transfer out of our prisons. Every single month, 20 to 30 people are waiting for transfer out of our prisons to the mental health services. In other words, they shouldn't have been in prison in the first place. And our lack of mental health services means that the prisons are used as a stopgap to keep these people safe from harming themselves and possibly harming someone else, whereas they should be treated in the mental health system. And again, on those first two, in terms of like drugs and mental health outreach approach, community outreach approach in Springfield, Oregon in the USA, where they have a crisis response team that when you phone 999, instead of getting the police, you get a crisis response team. The crisis response team is made up of a homeless activist, a mental health professional, and a medical person. They go out, and in 99% of cases they've been able to deal with it. In other words, it's a poor person freaking out, someone having a mental health crisis, and those three professionals are able to actually talk the person down, talk them around, or get them the help that they need. And in only 1% of cases did they have to call for backup. And this is in the heavily armed, and grossly unequal and alienated American society, where there's a high level of gun violence, and only in 1% of cases did that approach actually require backup. The next thing you need is free education and youth unemployment. I mean, people in working class areas, a lot of young people are drawn into the drug gangs. If you made drugs a health issue, you'd get rid of the cartels and the drug gangs. That would withdraw a lot of petty crime from our areas. And also then if you gave access to free education for young people from working class and disadvantaged areas, and also youth employment. And then finally, we need a focus on white collar crime, because actually, yeah, it's terrible. My granny was mugged, and someone stole her handbag, and that kind of interpersonal violence is reprehensible. But it was a product of probably a product of someone feeding a drug habit. In other words, if we had a decent health service and intervention in terms of addiction, that probably wouldn't have happened. But white collar crimes, like the banking debt, actually had a devastating effect on tens of thousands of lives simultaneously. And so often the ruling class will go on about the small crimes that occur in working class areas, the kind of petty crime and interpersonal violence, but they won't talk about white collar criminality. So in other words, I mean, long term, socialists want a society where there isn't vast inequality, where there isn't alienation, and slowly we start to take measures that actually undermine the soil out of which interpersonal violence, abuse, and conflict stems. And I think the last thing I wanted to say is that, like, the Gardaí are part of the machinery that keep us down. That their job isn't to fight crime. Statistically, they rarely solve crimes, and their real job is actually to hold working class people down. So when people say, why are the Gardaí oppressing the Debenhams workers? Why are they pulling the Debenhams workers off the picket line? Why don't they do their real job? Actually, them pulling workers off the picket line is their real job. That's what they're meant to do. That's what they're employed to do. And that's what the Gardaí, when they go back to the canteen and they chat to each other behind closed doors and make fun of the fact that they pulled someone off a picket line because they have to justify to themselves doing stuff like that every day. That's their real job. And fighting crime is just something that happens exceptionally. There's exceptional cases where they come across a burglary. I mean, if you're randomly patrolling an area, the chances of you coming across a burglary in action are very slim. And most of the time, they're going to come across it, hours or days after it's happened. And often when working class people found them in response to a crime, like when my grandmother was mugged, they turn up the next day. They take a few notes and then nothing ever happens in relation to those crimes. So they really don't really care what happens in working class areas. So I think we'll open it up there for discussion. I think the main point really is that the police are part of the machinery that holds working class people down, that the Gardaí were tainted from the moment of their birth. They're an unaccountable police force. They're a corrupt police force, and that in a socialist society, we'd have much better ways of dealing with people who committed acts of violence against each other. And there'd be no need for a station full of baton wielding people in every working class estate.